How many fingers, Winston? 4. Stop it. Stop it. How can you go on? 4. 4. How many fingers, Winston? 5. 5. No, Winston, that is no use. You're lying. You still think there are 4. How many fingers, please? 4, 5, 4. Anything you like, only stop the pain. Abruptly, he was sitting with O'Brien's arm around his shoulders. He had perhaps lost consciousness for a few seconds. The bonds that had held his body down were loosened. He felt very cold. He was shaking uncontrollably. His teeth were chattering. The tears were rolling down his cheeks. For a moment, he clung to O'Brien like a baby, curiously comforted by the heavier arm around his shoulders. He had the feeling that O'Brien was his protector, that the pain was something that came from outside, from some other source, and that it was O'Brien who would save him from it. "You're a slow learner, Winston," said O'Brien gently. "How can I help it?" he blowed. "How can I help seeing what is in front of my eyes? 2 + 2 are 4. Sometimes, Winston, sometimes there are 5, sometimes there are 3, sometimes there are all of them at once. You must try harder. It's not easy to become sane." That's an excerpt from 1984, written by George Orwell. In 1949, he published the book after fighting in the Spanish Civil War. He saw firsthand fascism, totalitarianism. The Spanish Civil War itself was a very interesting war, very fascinating. I could see you doing a video on that, but Orwell changed his opinions, right? He originally watched the Communist Revolution in Russia, volunteered to fight against the fascist government in the Spanish Civil War. He changed opinions after realizing behind the veneer of justice and equality lurked widespread famine, forced labor, internal power struggles, and political repression. So while fighting in the Spanish Civil War, Orwell became disillusioned with elements within the resistance forces that he felt wanted to replace the fascist government with an authoritarian regime of its own, right? So it was a cautionary tale when George Orwell wrote the book. During World War II, we saw the rise of Hitler and Stalin. He feared the totalitarian could easily take over the U.S. and Britain. Right, and this was back in 1949, had that fear. He wanted to warn the United States of the dangers of totalitarianism, the dangers of fascism. Something fascinating as of the Spanish Civil War. It was fought between the Republicans and the Nationalists, and between 1936 and 1939, those terms didn't necessarily mean what we think them to mean today, right? The Republicans themselves were the loyal left-leaning Popular Front. The government of the Second Spanish Republic consisted of various socialist, communist, separatist, anarchist, and Republican parties, and eventually they were supported by Russia. Stalin and 2,400 American volunteers fought for the communist, separatist, socialist, anarchist Republicans. The opposing nationalists were a alliance of phalangalists, monarchists, conservatives, and traditionals supported by the Germans. In the end, the nationalists won the war. Franco became the ruler of Spain, ruthless dictator until 1975. The war ended April 1939, which was several months before Germany invaded Poland, right? But the scene I read, the 4, how many fingers am I holding up, that actually played out was recreated in the Chain of Command Star Trek 2-part episode where Picard was captured by the Borg, and they asked him how many lights do you see, and if he said 4, he was tortured. Eventually he was rescued, but in the end he confessed to the counselor that he did see 5 lights. And if you jump back to 1984, Winston being tortured, as the story progresses, as the torture progresses, he eventually says, I see 5 fingers, right? And as O'Brien says, if the party says it's 5 fingers, it's 5 fingers, right? You don't get to decide how many fingers I'm holding up. If I say this is 5 fingers, if the party believes that's 5 fingers, then it's 5 fingers. If the party says it's 2 fingers, it's 2 fingers. And Winston believed, right? Enough torture, he believed, and he carried that on throughout the story, and learned to love the party, learned to love the reality that the party provided, right? He couldn't believe his own senses. He couldn't believe what he believed. He couldn't believe what he saw, what he thought. Party says 5. That's 5. Right, and that was a spoof. That was a spoof on the Soviet Union's 2 + 2 = 5, where they had a 5-year plan they were going to do in 4 years. But it's also, it's a cautionary tale, right? And in psychology, in modern psychology, we would call that operant conditioning. And you see operant conditioning every day, whereby a behavior you want is reinforced. Right, it's a combination of reinforcement, it's punishment, it's encouraging behaviors, it's punishing bad behaviors. It's a psychological theory originally described by B.F. Skinner, operant conditioning. Right, you have neutral responses from the environment that produce no stimulus other than focusing attention. Reinforcers, there are the responses from the environment that increase the likelihood of a behavior, and punishers, removing a behavior. So you probably see that in your own life, operant conditioning, and you see the correlation to perhaps what Orwell warned of when he wrote the book 1984, the idea of a totalitarian government. It's not enough for them to have power. They need people to believe. They need people to believe they're right. Everything they say is right. Anything they disagree with is wrong. And we're not at the point where people are necessarily being tortured. Fortunately, if this was 1984, if we were captured by the Borg, certainly people would be tortured. But you can see the idea of operant conditioning and how you might be punished for going against the party. Right, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you see. If I say this is 5 fingers, if the party says it's 5 fingers, it's 5 fingers, and it's a horrible reality. We'll say, said that in his own mind, he came out of that Spanish Civil War. He saw totalitarianism. He saw nationalism. He saw the start of World War II. He saw the fascists. He saw a lot of death, a lot of horrible things, and he wanted to give that warning. And that book carries a lot of other warnings around things like censorship, thought crimes, a lot of interesting stuff. If you've ever haven't read 1984, it's highly recommended. But I find the fascination of the story, of the idea where you are being compelled, we'll say compelled to say things you don't believe, things you don't think are true, where you have to doubt your own eyes. What would that be like? What would that look like? How do you know you're in a totalitarian regime? Certainly that would be one of the criteria is reality is what they say it is, right? And that's the fiction. That's the fantasy fiction of George Orwell in 1984 is the idea of absolute control, right, over your lives. And being in Winston's shoes and thinking of the idea of being tortured, right, is so easy if they hold up the hand to say, oh, of course that's 5 fingers. You don't have to torture me. I see 5 fingers, right? Don't torture me. That's exactly, I see exactly what you say. They don't care, right? That's fine. If you go along with it long enough, eventually you will believe you're indiscernible from those that don't believe how many fingers, that don't believe it's 4, and you'll say, I'll just go along and say it's 5. I don't want to be punished. I don't want to be tortured. I will see what you tell me to see. Right, not saying this relates to anything, right? Relates to anything, you're seeing nowadays. But it certainly is a fascinating warning coming from 1939. Here we are, 60, 80, trying to do a math in my head, 84 years later. He was warning, he saw these types of fascist, nationalist, totalitarian regimes taking over in Europe, taking over in Spain, taking over in Germany invading Poland, the rise of those evil regimes. He saw the horrible ways that they dominated, right? He saw famines, and he saw collapse and hardships and suffering, and this was a warning to England, a warning to the United States that even though it's not happening to you, perhaps one day in the future, you too could be overtaken by some totalitarian regime where your own thoughts, your own beliefs, your own eyes fail you, right? And you'll do what the party says. You will believe what the party says. You'll see what the party tells you to see. So I hope you liked it. Thank you for watching, guys. We appreciate you.